Raymond was an up-and-coming novelist with a passion for horror stories. He had always dreamed of writing a novel that would send shivers down readers' spines and keep them up at night. However, his life at home was far from the eerie and unsettling world he imagined for his stories. Raymond had 2 young children, a pair of rambunctious dogs, and a wife who was always on the go. Whenever he sat down to write, one of his kids would inevitably need his attention, or one of the dogs would start barking. And when he finally managed to get a few sentences down on paper, his wife would come home, interrupting his flow. Despite the constant distractions, Raymond was determined to finish his horror novel. He set strict boundaries with his family, making it clear that when he was writing, he needed to be left alone. He also found creative ways to work around the interruptions. For example, he would write in short bursts when his kids were at school and his wife was at work. As the weeks went by, Raymond's novel began to take shape. He was finally able to immerse himself in the dark and twisted world he had always imagined. And as he wrote, he began to notice that the real-life distractions he had been dealing with were starting to find their way into his story. His characters were plagued by the same interruptions that he had been dealing with at home. In the end, Raymond's novel was a huge success. Critics raved about the unique way in which it blended horror with the everyday struggles of family life. And while he was happy with the book, Raymond couldn't help but feel a little bit of nostalgia for the days when writing was a solitary pursuit, free from the constant distractions of home and family. Raymond's novel was a huge success, but it came at a great cost. As he wrote, he began to notice that the real-life distractions he had been dealing with were starting to find their way into his story. His characters were plagued by the same interruptions and distractions that he had been dealing with at home. But as the writing process progressed, these interruptions took on a dark and sinister twist. The characters in his story began to mirror the people in his life. His wife became a cruel and manipulative witch, his children turned into terrifying monsters, and his dogs became demonic beasts. And as he wrote, he found himself becoming more and more consumed by his own story. He became convinced that the events in his novel were happening in real life. As the deadline for his book approached, Raymond's obsession with his story grew. He became distant and unresponsive to his family, spending all of his time locked in his office, writing. His wife, who had always been supportive of his writing, became worried about his mental state. But Raymond was too far gone to hear her concerns. Finally, the day of the book's release arrived. Raymond's wife organized a launch party for him, but he didn't show up. Instead, the police found him in his office, surrounded by pages of his novel, covered in blood. It turned out that in his delusional state, he had killed his wife, children, and dogs and staged the scene as he had written in his horror novel. The book was a bestseller, but the price of its success was too high. Raymond was institutionalized, and the horrific events that he had written about had become a reality. And the only thing left behind was a haunting and terrifying novel that would forever be associated with the tragedy that had occurred in his own life. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider liking the video and subscribe to be notified of freshly baked, frightfully generic stories.